Get out!
Revenge Files with Nora. File 30. Rebecca. I will never forget that satisfying moment. My CFO was sitting in his corner office on the 37th floor in Tribeca, watching federal agents take away his computers, while I held the documents that ended his career. He had orchestrated a $100 million cryptocurrency fraud using our legitimate business. He had used our customer relationships, audit data, and reputation to legitimize his scheme. And when I saw the evidence before me, he thought I would stay silent. He was wrong. For over 4 years at Wexford Capital Partners, I worked believing I was building something real. Unbeknownst to me, I was contributing to the perfect cover-up of one of the biggest financial crimes in our company's history. Secret accounts, ghost transactions, fake financial statements, all passed through systems I helped create. But forensic accounting has one feature. Every transaction leaves a trace. Every fabricated number creates an inconsistency, and every fraud eventually encounters someone persistent enough to follow the trail. And that person was me. I documented everything. This is how I exposed the CFO who thought he was untouchable, and what it cost me to bring him down. My name is Rebecca Quinlan. Years ago, I started working as a senior financial analyst at Wexford Capital Partners, a mid-sized investment firm that occupied 3 floors of a stylish tower in Tribeca. It was the kind of place where the abstract art pieces in the lobby were more valuable than my apartment, and the coffee machines were more expensive than my car. Wexford managed portfolios for wealthy individuals and institutional clients, particularly pension funds and family offices seeking stable returns away from the volatility of public markets. On paper, my job was quite simple. Preparing reports to help our partners make informed decisions, analyzing investment opportunities, and creating financial models. In practice, however, I spent most of my time working with spreadsheets, comparing data, and identifying inconsistencies. I was good at this. I can say that I understood numbers better than I understood people. The CFO, Marcus Delmont, was the kind of executive who commanded respect through sheer presence alone. He had been with the firm for 12 years. He was tall, silver-haired, and charismatic. He had survived multiple market crashes and made it this far with his reputation intact. You could see that confidence in every move he made. Everyone at Wexford trusted Marcus unconditionally. He had final approval on every major financial decision, and his signature appeared on documents that moved hundreds of millions of dollars. For the first 3 years, I had no reason to question anything. The firm was growing. Our client base expanded. The partners were happy. My own career progressed steadily, from senior analyst to lead analyst to eventually managing a small team of 4. I received bonuses, promotions, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing my work contributed to something legitimate. The first red flag appeared that March. I was preparing quarterly reports for our institutional clients when I noticed a discrepancy in one of the subsidiary accounts. A transfer of $2.4 million had been logged as an investment in a blockchain technology fund. But when I searched for supporting documentation, I found nothing. There was no correspondence with fund managers, no prospectus, no due diligence file. There was only a single wire transfer and a brief memo signed by Marcus. I flagged it to my supervisor, Daniel Ostrowski. He glanced at my notes, shrugged, and told me Marcus handled certain investments personally. High-level stuff, Daniel said, above our pay grade. He suggested I focus on my assigned portfolios and let the executives manage their own projects. I tried to let it go. Daniel had been at Wexford for 8 years. If he was not concerned, maybe I was overreacting. But the discrepancy nagged at me. In my experience, legitimate investments left paper trails. They had documentation, verification, compliance checks. A $2.4 million transfer with nothing but a memo felt wrong. Over the following months, I started paying closer attention to certain details. Not obsessively, but I began noting inconsistencies when they crossed my desk. A second transfer to the same blockchain fund came in May, and a third in August. Each time, minimal documentation, minimal explanation. Each time, Marcus's signature as the sole authorization. By October of that year, the numbers had reached a point where I began to truly understand the significance of what I was doing. The private list I had compiled included 17 transactions, totaling nearly $38 million. All of them were flowing into crypto-related investments that seemed to exist only on paper. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. But no one was looking, no one was even paying attention. Our compliance officer, a pleasant man named Gerald who spent most of his time planning his retirement, rubber-stamped everything Marcus sent him. The partners trusted their CFO completely. And my direct supervisor had already told me to mind my own business. I had just reminded myself to focus on my own work when something happened that made me decide to dig deeper. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Most of the office had gone home. I was finishing a reconciliation report when I accidentally accessed a shared drive folder I had never seen before. A subfolder labeled Project Nexus contained files I was definitely not supposed to find. Inside were spreadsheets showing 2 sets of books. One matched our official quarterly reports, the numbers I worked with every day. The other showed a parallel structure, a shadow accounting system that tracked investments into something called the Nexus Digital Asset Fund. The numbers were staggering. According to these hidden records, over $100 million had been funneled into crypto investments that did not appear anywhere in our audited financials. My hands were shaking as I copied the files to a personal drive. This was not a minor accounting error. This was not creative bookkeeping. This was fraud on a scale that could destroy the entire firm and everyone who worked there. I spent that night in my apartment, the small one-bedroom in the West Village that I had worked years to afford, going through the hidden records. Marcus had been transferring assets from client accounts into his own personal crypto holdings through an elaborate network of shell companies and fake investment vehicles. The network he had built was complex yet remarkably elegant. Legitimate client investments were commingled with fraudulent transfers. Our real profits masked his theft. And the worst part was that our genuine work, the analysis and reports my team produced, created the camouflage that made the entire operation possible, making us complicit in the crime. How would you feel if you were in my shoes? I did not sleep that night. By morning, I had read through every document in the Project Nexus folder. The scope of the fraud became clearer with each file. Marcus was not just stealing from the firm. He was stealing from our clients, from pension funds that managed retirement savings for thousands of ordinary people, from family offices that trusted us with generational wealth. The hidden accounts showed transfers dating back nearly 4 years. This was not a recent scheme. This was systematic, calculated, and ongoing. Questions and possibilities kept spinning in my head. What was I supposed to do now? Going to my supervisor had already proven useless. The compliance officer was clearly compromised or negligent. The partners trusted Marcus completely. If I raised concerns internally, I would likely be seen as paranoid or worse, fired for accessing files I was not authorized to view, but staying silent was not an option either. I had spent over 4 years building my career on the foundation of honest work. Every model I built, every report I filed, every recommendation I made was grounded in the belief that financial analysis served a legitimate purpose. Learning that my work had been used to facilitate a $100 million fraud felt like a violation of everything I had worked for. I had unknowingly contributed to a crime. I thought about my father, a union electrician who had spent 40 years doing honest work with his hands. He had always told me that integrity was not something you could put a price on. The moment you compromise, he used to say, you lose something you can never get back. I wondered what he would think if he knew his daughter was sitting on evidence of massive financial crime, too afraid to act. By Thursday of that week, I had made my decision. I was not going to stay silent, but I was also not going to be reckless. If I was going to expose Marcus Delmont and his $100 million fraud, I needed to do it properly. I needed documentation that would hold up under scrutiny. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. And I needed protection, because whistleblowers who went public without preparation usually ended up destroyed. The next 3 months became a careful double life. By day, I performed my regular duties at Wexford, producing reports, attending meetings, and pretending everything was normal. By night, I built my case. I taught myself the basics of forensic accounting, learned how to trace blockchain transactions, and slowly assembled a timeline of the fraud that would eventually span over 400 pages. The key to understanding Marcus's scheme was the Nexus Digital Asset Fund. On paper, it appeared to be a legitimate crypto investment vehicle registered in the Cayman Islands. In reality, it was a shell company controlled entirely by Marcus through a series of offshore intermediaries. Client money flowed into Nexus, where it was converted to various cryptocurrencies, primarily Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then transferred to wallets Marcus controlled personally. The genius of the scheme was its integration with our legitimate operations. Marcus did not simply steal money outright. He created fake investment opportunities that mimicked our real strategies. When our clients saw returns from their crypto allocations, some of those returns were genuine market gains. Others were fabricated numbers designed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy while Marcus extracted funds for himself. I spent weeks tracing transactions through the blockchain. Cryptocurrency is often described as anonymous, but that is a misconception. Every transaction is recorded on a public ledger. With enough patience and the right tools, you can follow the money. I tracked transfers from Nexus to a series of intermediary wallets, then to exchanges where the crypto was converted back to dollars, and finally to accounts in Switzerland and Singapore that I later learned belonged to Marcus personally. Marcus had been careful. The audit trail was meticulous, but not enough. He had made the classic mistake of using recurring patterns, perhaps rushing through the process. The same wallet addresses, the same transaction amounts kept appearing repeatedly, showing up across multiple transfers. And most importantly, several transfers coincided with dates when Marcus was on vacation, yet the authorization timestamps showed they were processed from IP addresses in New York, which meant someone else had access to his credentials or the timestamps had been falsified. That January, I had my first major breakthrough. While reviewing archived emails, I found a correspondence thread between Marcus and an external attorney named Victor Solis. The emails discussed something called liquidity events in language that was clearly designed to obscure the true nature of the transactions. But one email contained an attachment that Marcus had apparently forgotten to delete. It was a spreadsheet showing the actual distribution of funds from Nexus, including a column labeled MD Personal that totaled over $47 million. I printed that spreadsheet at a FedEx office 3 blocks from my apartment, paying cash and using a fake name. I was becoming paranoid, but my paranoia felt justified. I was collecting evidence against a man who had stolen $100 million. People had lost everything for less. But this process had started to take an emotional toll on me. I could not tell anyone what I was doing. My friends noticed that I had changed. I was withdrawn, distracted, and constantly tired. My mother was worried, noticing the tension in my voice and calling more often. I made excuses, complained about work stress, and told her I was fine. But every day I walked into that office wore me down. I felt like I was playing a role. I smiled at Marcus in the hallway. I attended his quarterly briefings. I listened to him praise our team's work while knowing that same work was being used to rob our clients. There were moments I doubted myself. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was a legitimate explanation I was missing. Maybe Marcus could offer a reasonable justification if confronted, but I knew those wishes were just me fooling myself. The evidence was too clear, too consistent, too damning. I was not misinterpreting data. I was documenting a crime. By March, my private case file had grown to include over 1,200 documents, 340 pages of analysis, and blockchain records tracing $94 million in fraudulent transfers. I had identified the shell companies, the intermediary banks, the crypto wallets, and the final destinations of the stolen funds. I knew the names of the attorneys and accountants who had helped Marcus construct his scheme. And I had timestamps, IP logs, and email records that directly contradicted the official narrative in our audited financials. What I did not have was a safe way to bring this information forward. I had researched whistleblower protections extensively. The SEC's whistleblower program offered financial rewards and legal protection for people who reported securities violations. But the process was complex, and I had seen cases where whistleblowers were retaliated against despite supposed protections. I needed advice from someone who understood the system. I found that person through a chance encounter at a financial industry conference in Midtown. Her name was Priya, a former SEC enforcement attorney who now ran a small law firm specializing in whistleblower representation. After her talk on regulatory compliance, I approached her with what I thought was a casual question about hypothetical reporting scenarios. Priya saw through me immediately. "You are not asking hypothetically," she said, her eyes sharp. "You have something specific." I hesitated, terrified that I was about to trust the wrong person, but something in her demeanor gave me confidence. She was direct, experienced, and had spent years on the other side of these investigations. If anyone could help me navigate this properly, it was her. We met for coffee the following week at a quiet cafe in Gramercy. I brought a summary document, no names, no company identification, just an outline of what I had discovered. Priya reviewed it silently for 20 minutes. When she looked up, her expression was serious. "This is significant," she said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this is exactly the kind of case the SEC's Enforcement Division prioritizes." She paused. "But I need you to understand something. Once you file a complaint, there is no going back. Your life will change. Your career will change. Are you prepared for that?" I told her I was ready. I could not tell her how terrified I actually felt, but I also knew I had no choice and there was no other option. Over the next month, Priya and I prepared my formal complaint to the SEC. The process was exhausting. Every document had to be organized chronologically. Every claim had to be supported by concrete evidence. The complaint alone, not including the hundreds of supporting exhibits, was nearly 50 pages. Priya insisted on precision. "The SEC receives thousands of complaints every year," she explained. "Most of them go nowhere because they are vague or unsubstantiated. If you want enforcement to take this seriously, you need to hand them documents they can investigate." We communicated exclusively through Signal, the encrypted messaging app she recommended for sensitive discussions. No email trails, no phone records that could be subpoenaed. Priya had seen too many whistleblowers compromised by careless communications. I continued working at Wexford during this period, which became increasingly difficult. Every interaction with Marcus felt dangerous. I found myself analyzing his every word, looking for signs that he suspected something. Had he noticed the accessed files? Was he monitoring my computer activity? The paranoia was exhausting. One afternoon in late March, Marcus stopped by my desk. My heart nearly stopped. He smiled his usual confident smile and asked how my quarterly analysis was progressing. I managed to give a coherent response about the timeline and methodology. He nodded, made a comment about the importance of accurate reporting, and walked away. I spent the next hour torturing myself, convinced that he knew everything. But he did not know. I realized later that his visit was routine, part of his rounds through the office. But the fear and unease lingered. One careless moment could have brought everything to light. I had seen what happened to employees who crossed Marcus. A portfolio manager named David Bennett had refused a questionable investment decision. He was quietly reassigned to a dead-end role until he resigned. A compliance analyst named Jennifer Walsh had raised questions about certain transactions 2 years earlier. She was terminated within a month for performance issues. Marcus protected his operation ruthlessly. Anyone who got too close to the truth was eliminated before they could become a threat. I had no intention of becoming another casualty. That April, I filed my formal whistleblower complaint with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. Priya submitted it on my behalf, using the confidentiality protections the program offered. The complaint detailed everything I had discovered: the shell companies, the fake financials, the blockchain transactions, the hidden accounts, and the systematic theft of client funds. I included over 1,400 pages of supporting documentation. I named Marcus Delmont, his external attorneys, and the offshore entities involved in the scheme. Then I waited. The waiting was the hardest part. I had expected some immediate response, maybe a call from an SEC investigator, or at least an acknowledgement that my complaint had been received. Instead, there was silence. Weeks passed. I continued going to work, continued producing reports, continued pretending everything was normal. Priya assured me that this was typical. "The SEC moves slowly," she said. "They are verifying your information, cross-referencing it with their own data. Be patient. Patience was not easy. Every day I spent at Wexford felt like borrowed time. I had handed over evidence of a $100 million fraud. Eventually, that evidence would trigger an investigation. And when it did, my role in exposing Marcus would become clear. The first sign that my complaint had landed came in late May. I noticed unusual activity in the office. Audit files that normally sat dormant were being accessed. IT conducted what they called a routine security review of our network. Marcus seemed distracted during executive briefings, checking his phone more frequently, cutting meetings short. Something was happening behind the scenes. In June, I received a call from an SEC enforcement attorney named Mitchell Torres. He wanted to meet. "Your information has been extremely helpful," he said. "We are moving forward with a formal investigation." He asked if I was willing to cooperate further, potentially as a confidential source. I agreed immediately. Over the following weeks, I had multiple meetings with the SEC team. They asked detailed questions about Wexford's internal processes, about who had access to what systems, about how approvals were documented. I walked them through the shell company structure, explained how Marcus had manipulated our legitimate client accounts, and provided additional documentation they requested. The investigation was building momentum, but investigations take time, and secrets are hard to keep in a small office. By July, rumors started circulating at Wexford. People whispered about regulatory inquiries, about lawyers visiting the executive floor, about partners holding closed-door meetings that lasted for hours. The atmosphere became tense. Employees who had been collegial for years now eyed each other with suspicion. Marcus changed as well. The confident CFO who had commanded respect for over a decade no longer looked like his former self. He missed meetings and snapped at subordinates. He spent hours alone in his corner office, once a symbol of his status, some days even eating his meals there. I had been preparing myself for a much longer wait when that August, I arrived at work to find federal agents in the lobby. They were carrying boxes, seizing computers, and interviewing employees throughout the building. Wexford Capital Partners was officially under investigation for securities fraud. I was called into a conference room where Mitchell Torres and two other SEC attorneys were waiting. They explained that the investigation had progressed to the point where formal charges were being prepared. Marcus Delmont would be arrested within days. They thanked me for my cooperation and assured me that my identity as the whistleblower would remain protected as long as possible. As long as possible turned out to be about 72 hours. Naturally, I was quite uneasy and anxious. Can you understand the position I was in? Marcus was arrested at his home in Greenwich, Connecticut, 3 days later. The criminal complaint, which became public record, outlined his scheme in detail. Anyone who read it carefully could see that the information had come from someone inside the firm, someone with deep knowledge of Wexford's financial systems and access to internal documentation. Within the firm, speculation ran wild, but there were only a handful of people with both the knowledge and the access that the complaint demonstrated. I knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion fell on me. What I did not expect was how quickly it would happen. 4 days after his arrest, I received an email from our human resources director, a man named Philip Garrett. He wanted to meet the following morning to discuss operational matters related to the ongoing investigation. The phrasing was carefully neutral, but I understood what it meant. They had figured out it was me. I called Priya that night. She was calm but direct. "They cannot legally retaliate against you for filing a whistleblower complaint," she said, "but that does not mean they will not try. Document everything. Record every conversation if you can. And remember, the law is on your side." The meeting with Philip Garrett lasted about 45 minutes. He did not accuse me directly. Instead, he asked leading questions about my access to certain files, my communications with external parties, and whether I had shared confidential information outside the firm. As Priya had advised, I answered carefully, admitting nothing, denying nothing. When he asked if I had any involvement with the SEC investigation, I told him I could not discuss matters related to ongoing federal proceedings. The expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, I was placed on administrative leave pending further review. The official reason was a potential conflict of interest related to the investigation. The real reason was obvious. Wexford wanted me gone, and they were looking for any justification that would hold up legally. I spent the next 3 weeks in limbo. My access to company systems was revoked. My work email was suspended. Former colleagues, who had been friendly for years, suddenly stopped returning my calls. The isolation was deeply painful. I had dedicated over 4 years to that firm. I had believed in the work we did. And now, despite doing the right thing, I was being shunned, treated like a criminal. The breakthrough came in September. The SEC announced a settlement with Wexford Capital Partners that included significant penalties, mandatory compliance reforms, and the establishment of a restitution fund for affected clients. More importantly, Marcus Delmont was formally charged with 34 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He faced up to 40 years in federal prison. The criminal complaint named me as a cooperating witness, effectively confirming what everyone at Wexford already suspected, but by that point, I no longer cared about secrecy. The scheme was exposed. The fraud was documented, and Marcus Delmont, the untouchable CFO who had stolen $100 million while pretending to be a pillar of integrity, was facing the consequences of his actions. The days following the public announcement were surreal. My phone rang constantly, journalists seeking comment, former colleagues wanting to know what I knew, recruiters from competitor firms offering me positions. I ignored most of them. The only calls I answered were from Priya, who was helping me navigate the legal aftermath, and from my mother, who had finally learned the truth about why her daughter had seemed so stressed for the past 18 months. "I am proud of you," my mother said, during one of those calls. Her voice was thick with emotion. "Your father would have been proud too." It was the first time I had cried since the investigation began. It is in moments like these that you truly understand who really cares about you. Wexford formally terminated my employment late that September, citing irreconcilable differences and breach of confidentiality obligations. Priya immediately filed a retaliation complaint with the SEC and the Department of Labor. The evidence of illegal retaliation was overwhelming. I had been placed on leave and then fired specifically because I had reported criminal activity to federal authorities. The law explicitly prohibited such actions. The retaliation case moved faster than I expected. By November, Wexford's attorneys were seeking settlement discussions. They knew they could not win in court. The documentation I had compiled, including the emails from HR, the timing of my termination, and the statements from the meeting with Philip Garrett, made their position indefensible. We settled for a significant sum that I am legally prohibited from disclosing, plus a formal acknowledgement that my termination was improper. But the money was never the point. I had not become a whistleblower for financial reward. I did it because staying silent was not an option. Marcus Delmont's trial began the following February. I was called as a witness in March. Walking into that federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan, I felt the full weight of what I had set in motion. Marcus sat at the defense table, looking older than I remembered, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. His expensive suit could not disguise the fact that he was a man whose life was unraveling. I testified for 2 days. The prosecution walked me through the evidence I had collected, the documents I had analyzed, the transactions I had traced. The defense attorney tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the documentation spoke for itself. Every claim I made was supported by time-stamped files, blockchain records, and internal communications that Marcus himself had written. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution displayed the MD personal spreadsheet on the courtroom monitors. 34 witnesses watched as the column showing Marcus's personal take from the fraud scrolled across the screen. $47 million extracted from client accounts. $47 million stolen from pension funds and family offices and ordinary people who had trusted Wexford with their savings. Marcus looked at me only once during my testimony, when I described finding the Project Nexus folder for the first time. His expression was unreadable. I think he was trying to understand how the woman who had quietly analyzed spreadsheets for over 4 years had become the person who destroyed everything he had built. I held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the prosecutor. The jury deliberated for 6 days. Late that March, they returned guilty verdicts on 31 of 34 counts. Marcus Delmont was convicted of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He faced a statutory maximum of over 30 years in prison. His sentencing was scheduled for June. I was not in the courtroom when the verdicts were read. By then, I had started a new chapter. But I watched the coverage from my office at a competitor firm in Midtown, where I had accepted a position as a senior director of compliance. The irony was not lost on me. The skills I had used to expose Marcus's fraud were now being used to prevent such schemes from happening in the first place. The SEC's Whistleblower program awarded me a percentage of the penalties collected from Wexford and its affiliates. The amount was substantial, enough to change my financial situation permanently. But the real reward was simpler than money. It was knowing that I had done the right thing when doing the right thing was hard. Marcus was sentenced that June. The judge gave him 18 years in federal prison, citing the scale of the fraud, the breach of trust, and the impact on victims who had relied on Wexford to safeguard their financial futures. Marcus made a statement before sentencing, apologizing for his actions and asking for leniency. The judge was unmoved. I watched clips of the sentencing hearing later that evening. Marcus looked broken. His silver hair now fully gray, his confident posture replaced by something that looked like defeat. I felt many things watching him led away in handcuffs. Satisfaction, certainly, vindication, but also something unexpected. A strange kind of sadness for the waste of it all. Marcus Delmont had been talented, respected, successful. He could have had a legitimate career that anyone would envy. Instead, he chose theft. He chose deception. He chose to build an empire on fraud and watch it crumble when the truth emerged. The victims of his scheme eventually received partial restitution from the settlement fund. It was not everything they had lost, not even close, but it was something. I heard from several of them in the months following the trial. Pension fund administrators who thanked me for exposing the fraud before it could grow even larger. Family office representatives who said my actions had saved their clients from total ruin. Those messages meant more to me than any financial reward. It has been almost 2 years since I first discovered that Project Nexus folder. In that time, I have rebuilt my career, my confidence, and my belief in the possibility of accountability. I work now for a firm that takes compliance seriously, where documentation is viewed as protection rather than bureaucracy, where questions are encouraged rather than suppressed. Sometimes I think about the young analyst who walked into Wexford years ago, eager to prove herself, believing that hard work and integrity would be enough. She was naive in some ways. She did not understand how easily legitimate work could be corrupted, how quickly trust could be weaponized, how much courage it would take to stand up when everyone around her was looking away. But she was right about one thing. Integrity cannot be compromised. For over 4 years, I unknowingly helped build a fraudulent empire. Then I spent nearly 2 years tearing it down, and I would do it all over again. The moment you look the other way, the moment you decide that someone else's crime is not your problem, you become part of the machinery that allows fraud to flourish. Do you agree? Share your thoughts in the comments. The full purple file playlist's waiting, or discover other color files for more office revenge. See you in the next file.